The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Zoe Parker stood with her back against the wooden post, her wrists bound tightly behind her. Blood trickled down her raw skin where the ropes cut into her flesh, but she refused to show any sign of weakness to the jeering crowd that had gathered in the dusty town square of Copper Springs. It was the summer of 1875, and Zoe had been accused of stealing supplies from Barton's general store. She hadn't stolen anything, but being new in town with no family to vouch for her character made her an easy target when Mr. Barton discovered items missing from his inventory. The town sheriff, a man who valued expediency over justice, had sentenced her to a day tied to the punishment post as a warning to others. "Let this be a lesson to those who think they can take what isn't rightfully theirs," Sheriff Boggs had announced before leaving her to bake in the sun. Zoe's throat burned with thirst, and her vision blurred as sweat dripped into her eyes. She had been standing for hours, and her legs trembled with the effort of remaining upright. The townspeople who had gathered to gawk at her punishment gradually dispersed as the afternoon wore on, returning to their lives while she remained bound and exposed to the elements. As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, Zoe heard the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats approaching. She lifted her head weakly, squinting against the harsh light to see a lone rider coming down the main street. The stranger rode a magnificent black stallion, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. The rider pulled his horse to a stop several yards from the post. For a long moment, he simply observed her, and Zoe felt a flush of anger and humiliation rise to her cheeks despite her exhaustion. "Come to enjoy the show," she called out, her voice raspy from thirst and defiance. The man dismounted in one fluid motion. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements speaking of strength and purpose as he approached. When he stepped into better light, Zoe could see a face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes as blue as the Arizona sky and a strong, defined jaw partially covered by stubble. "Madam," he said simply, tipping his hat. His voice was deep and measured. "Name's Archer Wilson. I don't typically find entertainment in other people's suffering." He moved behind the post without another word. Zoe tensed as she felt him examining her bindings. "What are you doing?" she demanded, trying to glance over her shoulder. "Something that might get me in trouble," he replied. Zoe felt the cool metal of a knife blade against her skin, and then the blessed relief as the ropes fell away. Her knees buckled immediately, and she would have fallen if Archer hadn't caught her with strong, steady hands. "Easy now," he murmured, supporting her weight effortlessly. "How long have you been tied here?" "Since dawn," Zoe whispered, unable to stop the tears of relief that sprang to her eyes. She tried to take a step and stumbled again as pins and needles shot through her legs. Without hesitation, Archer swept her up into his arms. "You need water and shade," he said, carrying her toward the horse. "The sheriff will have you arrested," Zoe warned, even as she allowed herself to lean against his chest. A ghost of a smile crossed Archer's face. "Wouldn't be the first time I've had a disagreement with the law." He helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her, one arm securely around her waist to keep her from falling. Zoe knew she should protest, that riding out of town with a stranger was foolhardy, but the alternative was returning to the post or facing the sheriff's wrath. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as they rode slowly out of town. "I've seen enough injustice in my time," he replied. "Sometimes a man has to decide where he stands." They rode for nearly an hour, following a stream that wound its way through the scrubby landscape. Eventually, they reached a small cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping. A corral stood nearby, holding several horses that lifted their heads in curiosity as they approached. "My place," Archer explained, dismounting and lifting Zoe down carefully. "It's not much, but it's private and safe." Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A wooden table with 2 chairs occupied one corner, while a small stove stood in another. A neatly made bed was pushed against the far wall. Archer immediately poured water from a pitcher into a cup and brought it to her. "Small sips," he cautioned as she reached for it eagerly. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Zoe nodded, forcing herself to drink slowly despite her desperate thirst. When she had finished, Archer refilled the cup and then busied himself gathering supplies. "Let me see your wrists," he said, setting down a basin of water and clean cloths. Gently, he took her hands in his, turning them to examine the raw, bleeding flesh where the ropes had cut in. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man with such calloused hands. "This will sting," he warned, cleaning the wounds carefully. Zoe bit her lip against the pain but didn't pull away. When he had finished, he wrapped soft strips of cloth around her wrists. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes, "but I still don't understand why you're doing this." Archer was quiet for a moment. "I was riding through town and saw you there. Couldn't just ride on by." "Everyone else did," Zoe pointed out. "I'm not everyone else," he replied simply. He stood and moved to the stove. "You should rest. I'll make something to eat." As Archer prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon, Zoe found herself studying him. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. His clothes were worn but clean denims, boots, and a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. "How long have you been in these parts?" she asked, breaking the silence. "About 2 years," he replied. "Bought this place from an old trapper heading north. Keep to myself mostly, do some horse trading. And before that," a shadow crossed his face, "I rode with a cattle outfit in Texas." "Before that? Well, that's a longer story." Zoe sensed there was much he wasn't saying, but she didn't press. She had her own reasons for not wanting to discuss the past. After they had eaten, Archer insisted she take the bed while he made a pallet on the floor. Despite her protests that she had imposed enough, he was adamant. "Madam, my mother would haunt me from the grave if I let a lady sleep on the floor while I took the bed," he said with finality, and Zoe was too exhausted to argue further. Sleep claimed her almost instantly, but her dreams were troubled, filled with jeering faces and ropes that tightened of their own accord. She woke with a start in the gray light before dawn, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings until memory returned. Archer was already up, stoking the fire in the stove. He glanced up as she sat up in bed. "Morning," he said quietly. "How are you feeling?" Zoe took stock of her body. Her muscles ached and her wrists throbbed dully, but the desperate thirst and dizziness were gone. "Better," she admitted. "Thank you." He nodded and turned his attention back to the stove. "We need to figure out what happens next," he said. "Sheriff Boggs isn't a man who likes to be crossed." Reality crashed back over Zoe like a bucket of cold water. In the sanctuary of Archer's cabin, she had momentarily forgotten the predicament she was in. "I can't go back to town," she said. "They'll just tie me to that post again or worse." "What exactly happened?" Archer asked. "Why were you being punished?" Zoe explained about the missing supplies and the accusation of theft. "I didn't take anything," she said fiercely. "I had just started working at the Silver Dollar Saloon, serving drinks. I barely had enough money for a room at the boarding house, let alone extra to buy supplies." Archer studied her face. "I believe you," he said finally, "but that doesn't change the fact that Boggs will be looking for both of us now." "I don't want to bring trouble to your door," Zoe said, rising from the bed. "I should move on, maybe head to Tucson or with what?" Archer interrupted. "No supplies, no horse, and a reputation as a thief. You wouldn't make it 20 miles. The blunt assessment stung, but Zoe knew he was right. She had nothing but the clothes on her back. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked. Archer was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that. There's a man in town, Francis Collier. He owns the bank and has no love for Boggs. If we can convince him to look into who really took those supplies, we might be able to clear your name. And if we can't, then I'll help you get to Tucson," he said simply. Zoe stared at him. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Archer met her gaze steadily. "Maybe I'm tired of seeing people with power push around those without it. Maybe I've been in your position before. Or maybe," he paused, "maybe there's something about you that makes me want to help." A warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun spread through Zoe's chest. She looked away quickly, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must appear after her ordeal. "I should clean up," she said, changing the subject. Archer nodded toward a screen in the corner. "There's water and soap behind there, and—" he hesitated. "I have some clothes that might fit you. They belong to my sister." The mention of a sister caught Zoe's attention, but Archer's expression made it clear he wouldn't welcome questions. He retrieved a bundle from a trunk and handed it to her without meeting her eyes. Behind the screen, Zoe washed away the dust and sweat of the previous day, wincing as the water touched her raw wrists. The clothes Archer had provided were simple, but well made: a cotton blouse and a long skirt. They were slightly large, but far better than her dirt-stained garments. When she emerged, Archer glanced up, and something in his expression made her breath catch. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. "They suit you," he said finally, his voice lower than usual. "Thank you," Zoe replied, feeling a blush creep into her cheeks. "For everything." Their breakfast was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Archer was on his feet in an instant, peering out the window. "2 riders," he reported, his voice tense. "One of them's wearing a badge." Zoe's heart raced. Sheriff Boggs? No, his deputy Miller. Archer moved quickly to a chest by the bed and extracted a revolver, checking it before tucking it into his belt. "Stay inside," he instructed, heading for the door. Zoe followed him to the window, watching as he strode out to meet the approaching men with a casual confidence that belied the tension she had seen in his shoulders. "Morning, gentlemen," Archer called as the riders approached. "What brings you out this way?" Deputy Miller, a thin man with a perpetual scowl, reined his horse to a stop. "Looking for a woman," he said without preamble. "Dark hair, green eyes. She escaped custody yesterday. Thought she might have headed this direction." "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Archer replied, his tone neutral. "Been here all night and no one's passed by." The second rider, a burly man with a red face that Zoe recognized as Barton, the store owner, leaned forward in his saddle. "You sure about that, Wilson?" "Because someone cut her free and there were tracks heading this way." "Lots of trails around here," Archer observed. "Could have been anyone." Miller's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we take a look inside your cabin?" "Actually, I do mind," Archer said, his posture shifting slightly. "Last I checked, you need more than suspicion to search a man's home." Miller's hand moved closer to his gun. "I've got probable cause. Those tracks lead right here." "And I've got a right to privacy," Archer countered, his hand resting casually near his own weapon. "If Sheriff Boggs wants to talk to me, he's welcome to ride out here himself with a proper warrant." The tension stretched between the men. Zoe held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain they could hear it outside. Finally, Miller spat in the dust. "We'll be back, Wilson." "With the sheriff and that warrant." "I'll be here," Archer replied calmly. The 2 men turned their horses and rode away, throwing dark looks over their shoulders. Archer watched until they disappeared from view before returning to the cabin. "We don't have much time," he said, immediately beginning to gather supplies. "Boggs will be back before sundown and he won't be as easily discouraged as Miller." "What are we going to do?" Zoe asked, helping him collect food and canteens. "We're going to visit Francis Collier," Archer said. "But not in town. He has a hunting cabin about 10 miles from here. With luck, he'll be there checking his traps." Within half an hour, they had packed provisions and saddled 2 horses. Archer had insisted Zoe take his gentlest mare, a dappled gray named Pepper. As they rode away from the cabin, Zoe glanced back at the simple structure that had been her sanctuary for too brief a time. "Will you be able to come back here?" she asked, guilt churning in her stomach at the thought that she might have cost him his home. Archer's expression was unreadable. "Let's worry about clearing your name first," he said. They rode in silence for a time, following game trails through increasingly rugged terrain. The landscape changed gradually from scrubby desert to pine-covered hills as they gained elevation. Despite the circumstances, Zoe found herself marveling at the wild beauty surrounding them. "It's beautiful out here," she said, breaking the silence. Archer nodded. "That's why I stayed. After years of drifting, I found peace in these mountains." "Where did you drift from?" Zoe asked, seizing the opening to learn more about the enigmatic man who had risked so much to help her. He was quiet for so long that Zoe thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if coming from years away. "I was born in Virginia. When the war came, I joined up like most young fools eager for glory. Found nothing but horror instead." He paused, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Afterward, home didn't feel like home anymore, so I headed west, working cattle drives, breaking horses, taking whatever honest work I could find." "And your sister?" Zoe asked gently, remembering the clothes she now wore. Pain flashed across Archer's face. "Sarah died of typhoid 3 years ago in Kansas. She was traveling with me, hoping to make a fresh start." His hands tightened on the reins. "I couldn't save her." The raw grief in his voice made Zoe's heart ache. Impulsively, she reached across the space between their horses and touched his arm. "I'm sorry," she said simply. He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without looking at her. They rode in companionable silence for another hour before Archer pointed to a plume of smoke rising from the trees ahead. "That'll be Collier's cabin," he said. "Let's hope he's in a listening mood." As they approached the small wooden structure, a man emerged onto the porch, a shotgun in his hands. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with a shock of white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. "That's far enough," he called, raising the weapon. "State your business." Archer reined his horse to a stop and raised his hands slightly. "Mr. Collier, it's Archer Wilson. We met at the horse auction in Copper Springs last month. I need to speak with you about an urgent matter." The man squinted at them for a long moment before lowering the shotgun. "Wilson, eh?" "The horse trader. Come ahead, but slowly." They dismounted and approached the cabin. Collier's sharp eyes moved from Archer to Zoe, and his bushy eyebrows rose. "You're the girl they had tied to the post yesterday," he observed. "Thought you looked familiar." Zoe tensed, but Collier waved them inside without further comment. The interior of the cabin was rustic but comfortable, with animal pelts covering the floor and a fire burning in a stone hearth. "Sit," Collier instructed, placing the shotgun within easy reach. "Now explain why you've brought a fugitive to my door, Wilson." Archer explained the situation while Zoe watched Collier's face for any sign of his thoughts. The banker listened without interruption, his weathered features revealing nothing. "So you're saying she's innocent of the theft," Collier summarized when Archer finished, "and you want me to help clear her name?" "Yes, sir," Archer confirmed. "You're respected in town and you have influence with people Boggs can't intimidate." Collier stroked his beard thoughtfully. "What makes you so certain she's telling the truth?" Before Archer could respond, Zoe spoke up. "Mr. Collier, I have nothing to offer as proof except my word. I came to Copper Springs because I heard there was work. My parents died last year in a fire that took our farm in Kansas. I've been working my way west ever since, taking whatever honest jobs I could find. She met his gaze steadily. I'm not a thief, sir. I was raised to believe that taking what isn't yours is one of the worst sins a person can commit. Collier studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. I believe you, Miss Parker, he said finally. And as it happens, I may know something about those missing supplies. Both Zoe and Archer straightened in their chairs. My teller, young Jenkins, mentioned seeing Barton's nephew loading crates into a wagon late one night last week, Collier continued. Thought it was odd timing, but didn't think much more of it until now. The nephew, Archer mused. Tim Barton. He's got a reputation for gambling more than he can afford to lose. Collier nodded. And his uncle has been complaining about inventory discrepancies for months, well before Miss Parker arrived in town. Hope blossomed in Zoe's chest. If we could prove it was Tim, would that be enough to clear my name? It might, Collier said, if we had evidence. But it would be your word against his, and the Bartons have been in Copper Springs for 20 years. Where would Tim sell stolen goods? Archer asked. Collier's eyes narrowed in thought. There's a trading post about 30 miles south that doesn't ask too many questions. Old Gus Turner runs it. If Tim's been selling stolen goods, that's where he'd go. Archer nodded decisively. Then that's where we need to look. If we can find proof that Tim sold those supplies, we can take it to Judge Wallace in Harrison. He's fair-minded and won't be swayed by Boggs. It's a solid plan, Collier agreed, but it won't be easy. Boggs will have men searching for both of you by now. We don't have much choice, Archer said grimly. If we do nothing, Zoe faces jail or worse when they catch her. Collier rose from his chair. You can rest here tonight. I'll provide you with fresh horses and supplies in the morning. The trail to Turner's trading post is treacherous. You'll need daylight. That night, after Collier had retired to his room, Zoe and Archer sat before the fire, speaking in low voices. You didn't have to get involved in this, Zoe said, watching the firelight play across Archer's features. You could have just cut me free and ridden away. Archer looked at her, the flames reflected in his blue eyes. No, he said quietly. I couldn't have. Why? She pressed, needing to understand what drove this man to risk everything for a stranger. He was silent for a long moment. When I saw you tied to that post, it reminded me of something I saw during the war, a young woman accused of spying. They left her tied in the sun for 2 days before. He stopped, his jaw tightening. I was following orders then. I didn't intervene. I've never forgiven myself for that. You were a soldier, Zoe said gently. You had to follow orders. There comes a point when a man has to decide what kind of person he wants to be, Archer replied. I made the wrong choice then. I wasn't going to make the same mistake again. Impulsively, Zoe reached out and took his hand. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Archer's fingers curled around hers, warm and strong. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, a possibility. They sat in silence, hands joined, watching the fire burn down to embers. The journey to Turner's trading post the next day was arduous. The trail wound through steep canyons and across rocky plateaus where a misstep could mean disaster. By mid-afternoon, they crested a ridge and saw their destination nestled in a small valley below. Remember, Archer cautioned as they began their descent, we're just passing through, looking to trade. Don't mention Barton or Copper Springs unless Turner brings it up. The trading post was a ramshackle collection of buildings surrounded by a crude wooden fence. As they approached, Zoe noticed wagons and horses in various states of repair scattered around the property. A grizzled man smoking a pipe emerged from the main building as they dismounted. His shrewd eyes took in every detail of their appearance. "Don't get many visitors this time of year," he remarked, removing the pipe from his mouth. "What can I do for you folks?" "Just passing through," Archer replied easily. "Looking to trade for supplies before heading south." The man, presumably Turner, nodded slowly. "Got plenty to trade." "Come inside." The interior of the trading post was dim and cluttered with goods of all descriptions: clothing, tools, weapons, and household items stacked on shelves and hanging from the rafters. Zoe wandered through the store, ostensibly examining merchandise but actually searching for anything that might have come from Barton's store. In a back corner, she found what she was looking for: a stack of blankets with the distinctive blue stripe that Barton used to mark his goods. She caught Archer's eye and gave a slight nod toward the blankets. He acknowledged with a nearly imperceptible dip of his chin. "These are fine blankets," Archer commented, moving to examine them. "Where'd you get them?" Turner shrugged. "Young fella brings goods through regular. Said he works for a distributor up north." "He wouldn't happen to be coming back soon?" Archer asked casually. "I might be interested in dealing directly if the price is right." "Should be here tomorrow or the next day," Turner replied. "Regular as clockwork, that one. Every 2 weeks with a new load." Zoe and Archer exchanged glances. If Tim Barton was expected in the next day or two, they could wait and catch him red-handed. They purchased minimal supplies and asked Turner about camping nearby. He directed them to a small creek half a mile away, mentioning that it was a popular spot for travelers. As they made camp that evening, Zoe couldn't help but notice how naturally they worked together, moving around each other with an easy familiarity that belied their short acquaintance. "What will happen after this is over?" she asked as they sat beside their small fire. "Assuming we can prove Tim is the thief." Archer poked at the fire with a stick. "You'll be free to go wherever you want," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Tucson, California. Wherever you were heading before all this happened." Zoe watched his profile in the firelight. "And what if I don't want to leave?" she asked softly. Archer's head came up, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. "What are you saying, Zoe?" "I'm saying that in the midst of this nightmare, I found something unexpected," she replied, her heart pounding. "Someone unexpected." Archer set the stick down and moved around the fire to sit beside her. "I've been alone a long time," he said quietly. "Thought it was better that way, safer." "And now?" Zoe prompted when he fell silent. He reached out slowly and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch feather-light. "Now I'm not so sure." The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. When Archer finally leaned forward to kiss her, it felt like coming home after a long journey. His lips were gentle against hers, a question rather than a demand. Zoe answered by sliding her hands up to his shoulders, drawing him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and necessary, a promise exchanged without words. When they finally broke apart, Archer rested his forehead against hers. "We should get some rest," he murmured. "Tomorrow could be a long day." They settled side by side near the fire, hands intertwined as they drifted toward sleep beneath a canopy of stars. The sound of approaching horses woke them shortly after dawn. Archer was instantly alert, reaching for his revolver before he was fully upright. "Stay down," he whispered to Zoe, moving to the edge of their camp to peer through the trees. A wagon was making its way toward the trading post, driven by a young man Zoe recognized immediately as Tim Barton. Beside him sat another man she didn't know. "It's him," she confirmed when Archer returned to her side. "That's Tim Barton." They quickly broke camp and mounted their horses, following the wagon at a distance. When it reached the trading post, they tied their horses in a nearby grove and crept closer on foot. From their hiding place behind a stack of crates, they could see Tim and his companion unloading goods from the wagon while Turner checked items off a list. "That's the shipment that went missing 3 days ago," Zoe whispered, recognizing several items. "The day before I was accused." Archer nodded grimly. "We need to hear them talk about it. Need proof this isn't legitimate business." They didn't have to wait long. Once the wagon was unloaded, Turner invited the men inside, leaving the door open to catch the morning breeze. Their voices drifted clearly to where Zoe and Archer concealed themselves. "This is quality merchandise, Tim," Turner was saying, "but you're bringing too much at once. People will start asking questions." Tim laughed. "No one's asking questions. I've got the perfect scapegoat, some drifter girl new to town. Sheriff already had her tied to the post for stealing. By now, they're probably looking for her in the next county. And your uncle doesn't suspect." "Uncle Barton's too busy counting his money to notice what's missing until inventory day," Tim replied smugly. "And even then, I've got him convinced it's customer theft. It's perfect." Archer's jaw tightened as he listened. "That's enough," he murmured to Zoe. "We have what we need. Let's go." They retreated to their horses and rode hard for Harrison, the nearest town with a circuit judge. Judge Wallace listened to their story with growing concern, examining the written testimony they had prepared detailing everything they had witnessed. "This is a serious matter," the judge said finally. "Sheriff Boggs overstepped his authority and a serious miscarriage of justice has occurred." He penned a quick note and handed it to his clerk. "I'm issuing warrants for Tim Barton's arrest and an order for your immediate exoneration, Miss Parker. I'm also sending a telegram to the territorial marshal about Sheriff Boggs's conduct." Relief washed over Zoe. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Don't thank me," the judge replied. "Thank Mr. Wilson here for having the courage to stand up for what's right. It's not often a man risks everything for a stranger." 2 weeks later, Zoe stood on the porch of Archer's cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The door opened behind her and Archer stepped out, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "Beautiful evening," he commented, handing her one of the cups. Zoe accepted it with a smile. Every evening here is beautiful. Much had changed in those 2 weeks. Tim Barton had been arrested and Sheriff Boggs had been suspended pending an investigation. Francis Collier had offered Zoe a position at the bank, saying he could use someone with her integrity. But the most significant change had been between her and Archer. What had begun as an act of compassion had blossomed into something neither of them had expected to find. "I got a letter from the land office today," Archer said, leaning against the porch railing. "They've approved my claim for the additional acreage to the north. Good grazing land for the horses." "That's wonderful," Zoe replied, genuinely pleased for him. She hesitated, then added, "I found a small house for rent in town. Mrs. Thornton mentioned it yesterday at the bank." Archer turned to look at her, his expression suddenly guarded. "Is that what you want, to live in town?" Zoe set her cup down and moved to stand before him. "What I want," she said carefully, "is to be wherever you are, but I don't want to assume." Archer set his own cup aside and took her hands in his. "Zoe Parker," he said, his voice low and earnest, "from the moment I cut you free from that post, something changed in me. I've been wandering for years, never staying in one place too long, never letting myself get too attached to anyone." His thumbs brushed gently over her knuckles. "But now, for the first time since before the war, I feel like I've found a reason to put down roots. If you want to stay not just in Copper Springs but here, with me, nothing would make me happier." Zoe's heart swelled with emotion. "Are you asking me to marry you, Archer Wilson?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A slow smile spread across his face. "I believe I am," he replied, though I had planned something more romantic than standing on the porch discussing real estate. Zoe laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "This is perfect," she assured him, reaching up to touch his face. "And yes, I will marry you." Archer pulled her into his arms, his kiss a promise of all the days to come. As they stood together in the fading light, Zoe marveled at how a moment of terrible injustice had led her to the greatest happiness she had ever known. 1 year later, they stood in the same spot, watching another sunset. But now the cabin had expanded into a proper home, with a garden Zoe had planted and a nursery waiting for the child that would arrive before winter. "Any regrets?" Archer asked, his arm around her shoulders. Zoe leaned into his embrace, her hand resting on her growing belly. "Not a single one," she replied truthfully. "Every moment, even the difficult ones, led us here." Archer placed his hand over hers. "When I cut you free that day, I never imagined I was actually freeing myself," he said softly. As the last light of day gilded the landscape before them, Zoe thought about the strange path that had brought her to this moment, from the humiliation of being bound to a post in a town square to finding love, purpose, and a home with the man who had risked everything to help a stranger. "Sometimes," she murmured, "the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best ones." Archer's arms tightened around her in silent agreement as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to the life they had built together from the most unlikely of beginnings.